Thank you. And again, thank you for agreeing to be on the response panel. And I wanted to start on the people, private, public, new forms of collaboration, how we can work better together to drive better urban solutions. And maybe, Mayor Kabell, if I could start with you. Copenhagen is renowned for its cycling and its efforts in terms of putting in very strong cycling networks. And when considering that, I guess maybe if you could share some of the insights from your perspective of what's worked well and how you're taking that even further to deal with other ways of people being active and getting around Copenhagen.
Thank you. Yeah, we are trying our best on the bicycle area in Copenhagen. Reached a level of a little more than 40% of all commuting being done by bicycle today. Quite okay. I'm not satisfied yet. Far from, actually. But the point of us, for us has been 3 points: infrastructure, infrastructure, and infrastructure. Build it, and they'll get on to the bicycle lanes. That's the message, that's the lesson that we've learned in Copenhagen, that building a coherent network, building a network that reaches all parts of the city and makes it possible to go wherever you want from A to B, then you feel safe on the bicycle, then it is safe to be on the bicycle. And of course, providing a bicycle network with enough capacity to also be able to hold all these people and to make it easy for people, making the right choice the easy choice, and of course making everybody feel that way, that any parent will never have a problem of sending his or her kids off to school alone on a bicycle. I mean, that should be the aim for anybody, because bicycling, basically it's not about the mammals, the middle-aged men in Lycra. They are not really interesting. It's interesting when a father brings his kids off to school in a cargo bike, or letting the kids run on themselves to school or wherever they are going. Then you actually have a city that is safe and where you're making a city that is livable. That's for everybody.
And maybe just to follow up on that, because you do have a very high percentage of cycling. Now, there's been, and we saw in our study, a real uptake of electric vehicles, personal electric vehicles. How are you incorporating that into your networks, and is this an issue in terms of conflict between electric vehicles, like scooters, for example, and bicycles?
Well, scooters basically don't exist in Copenhagen. I'll say very few of them. But what we see on the electrical vehicle side is, well, it's great, and we don't have any problems with that, as long as they replace the fossil cars and the fossil vehicles. Then I have no problems at all, except for the fact that they actually create more congestion. I mean, an electrical car or a hydrogen car is great in terms of environment and climate, but it still takes up so much more space than public transport and bicycles that it's actually bad for the efficiency of mobility in the city, because space is a scarce commodity. Space is a limited resource, and that means that if I had the 300,000 bicyclists every morning choosing a car, I mean, yeah, exactly.
It would take you a lot longer to get to work.
That would mean that the cars would be congested or would be deadlocked from 6 o'clock in the morning and would probably never reopen unless somebody took a helicopter and flew them away. I mean, it's simply not possible. So therefore, electrical cars are only good if they actually replace fossil cars.
Right, great. If I can turn to President Kim, we showed a couple of images actually of the Cheongi Cheong, which is a major urban transformation program in Seoul. What are some of the, I guess, the lessons from your side that's been really required to create that type of urban innovation, and coupled with then connecting it to a larger open space network that you now have along the riverfronts and along a lot of the streams? And so maybe if you can comment on some of the things that you've been looking at in terms of that cooperation that's needed to actually drive a better outcome.
Well, before starting my discussion, I'd like to say my heartfelt thanks to CLC and ULI, not because just inviting me to here, but because you gave a good chance to free ride your research result to apply to Seoul. You know, Actually, this project is mostly based on the Singapore. It's highly dense city and very quickly developed city. So just imagine which cities are mostly applicable. I mean, the Copenhagen? No, maybe Seoul would be the first city which can apply your result and implement your result.
We are waiting for you.
Thank you. So, I just want to talk about the alignment of internally. You know, we usually say the alignment externally is quite difficult because it requires some political process. But the internal alignment is, we usually regard is quite easy. But from our experience, you know, I mean, the Seoul metropolitan government already declared that our city will be a Car-Lite city and pedestrian-friendly city. And in every measures, I mean, in every department, they are making their own policies for that goal. But for example, if we think about the Department of Landscape, it's quite imaginable. They can make the pedestrian way more greenery, green way. But in order to obtain their goal, achieve their goal, they put more trees there because they are assessed by how many trees they planted. So in some sense, that makes pedestrians make difficult to walk through. And another example is Department of Bicycle. We may easily think that bicycle and pedestrian is quite friendly, but in order to get more bicycle lane, they sometimes try to sacrifice the pedestrian way. So even though we say we are heading for the Car-Lite or pedestrian-friendly policy, but in reality it's different. So last year we started a project which was asked by the Seoul metropolitan government. That project is just a check every manuals on the street. You know, street manuals in the landscape department is only for that purpose, and the bicycle department is the same. So it took really hard working to align that kind of manuals. Many of points are conflicting. So in short, I'd like to emphasize the coordination or alignment internal. So I think it's quite, technical issue, and for that I think some monitoring department or monitoring team should be included to make more realistic manuals.
That's a very good point, because I think that came up in our road design conversations about who actually controls the road design. And then similarly, where here in Singapore, the Land Transport Authority has put in an active mobility department, but that active mobility department is actually very separate from the highways group in terms of that road right-of-way. So it's a very interesting, and I like the fact you have a department of bicycles.
Yeah, maybe we should start a department of bicycles too, because what you shared is exactly some of the problems that we are facing in implementing, and also the space sharing framework that we have set up. So this is a really good segue for me to bring the discussion onto strategies with working with the private sector. And Gabe, you've spent some time in both the public and private sector, especially in startups. So what's your take on this, especially how cities can work with the private sector to create win-win solutions for both the government, business, as well as for commuters?
Yeah. Before I get started, I think we're all on stage. There's like 8 seats up here, so if anybody wants to come in, come on in, come on. You will be stuck in the front, but that's okay. Come on up. So, when I was in the private sector, I felt like I was battling the government to let them allow me to try things. And the answer was always, yeah, come back. Come back in a year, come back in 2 years. Well, by then the business model was defunct, it didn't matter. And then you would find that champion internally that maybe was willing to cut through the bureaucracy and let you do a pilot test. Put a car sharing vehicle on the street, put in a bike lane in front of your bike shop, things of that nature. And when I got into government, I really wanted to run government like a startup. And so we did a lot of different things. On the Complete Streets front, we actually dissolved, so we had a bicycle, a pedestrian, Complete Streets organization. We dissolved it all into one unit, all under Complete Streets, because we felt like it was too siloed. And we were at the point in our development where we had to put it all together. We also viewed our constituents as customers, and we started using different terminology to talk about our customers, which made it easier to interface with the private sector. So when the private sector would come with ideas, I instructed my people to first say yes instead of no, or say how instead of no, and to basically open the door to innovation. And that was the first step. And then we would talk about how do we conduct a pilot, a test that's low risk, potentially high reward. And that meant data. That meant saying, okay, what is the state beforehand? Let's try this for a month, a year. Let's track it. Let's let the public know and other stakeholders that we're trying this, that it's not set in stone. And suddenly it removed a lot of their objections. A lot of times government agencies don't want to do things because they're scared of a shrill minority that's going to come out and say, no, 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 no. So first of all, you have to not be so scared of that. But second of all, when you tell people that you're trying something and that you want their help and you want their feedback, it's amazing how you remove most of their objections. And then there's an old saying in the US, possession is 9/10 of the law. So once you put in that new facility that you're trying, the people that were resistant to changing, to try that, they often don't want to change it back. And that's a good thing. And the private sector is very willing to step up. In that bike lane that they showed, it's actually from Chicago, not from Washington, but in that facility we put in all kinds of technology, cameras and sensors, all for free, because the private sector was dying to try their wares in a real world environment. And so then when we would go back, we would potentially contract with them to use their services or their materials.
Which is a good point to now begin to talk about the people sector. And Konrad, you have been the founder of the Eco Mobility Festival in several cities, and you have been a strong champion of making use of city streets and public spaces for common good through creative collaborations with the community. Would you be able to share some of these ideas and stories with us, please?
Sure, I will say something about the city of Soo-hyun in Korea. So earlier on there was a little bit mix-up between Seoul, Soo-hyun and Korea. So Soo-hyun is a city of 1.2 million inhabitants, 30 kilometers south of Seoul. The mayor is fairly progressive. I once had a lunch with the mayor and we shared ideas about urban transport and mobility. And he was very concerned about the fact that we as humans will run out of mineral oil at some stage in the near future. So we need to get to other fuels anyway. That cars are blocking all the streets and taking too much public space, so that something needs to change. And he wanted to have sort of like a radical approach for people to learn that we need to go towards a greener future. So I came up with the idea and shared with him, why don't we just make a part of the city car-free for a month? And he was enthusiastic about it. And we organized a neighborhood. Basically, I cannot say we, it was him, and the neighborhood to actually bring it about. A very small one, 4,300 people, 1,500 cars in the area. So those 1,500 cars were removed from the area for 1 month. People adopted an eco-mobile lifestyle. Eco-mobility stands for walking, cycling, and use of public transport. And we helped bringing in all sorts of small vehicles, bicycles of course, but also special bikes like recumbent bikes and tricycles and so on, velo cabs, velo taxis, and also small electric vehicles. The city organized neighborhood shuttles based on electric golf carts or club cars, so that those people who were in need of having some transport would be transported in a very flexible, on-demand basis. And this went on for 1 month. Why 1 month? Because a car-free Sunday is nice, but that's an event, it's enjoyable. You can drink, you can eat, you can cycle, but it's of not so much value when you want to change people's attitudes. People need to experience, at least once in their life, how a car-free city could look like, how it feels like, how the street space is like in terms of noise is suddenly gone. You suddenly hear people and birds. That's a totally different experience when you get out of the door. And people actually felt afterwards that it was a huge community building process. Some people said they have for the first time talked to their neighbor. Previously they saw him going out of the building and enter the car and drive off, but they've never talked. Now they were in the streets because the space was there. And in short, the whole exercise to plan it and to prepare it was a process of going through extraordinary intensity of public discussion process with people being fiercely against it, other people being enthusiastically in favor of it. So there were sort of these borderlines going through families, I was told. And they were fighting at the dinner table. And there were, of course, the fathers who wanted to go with their SUV, and they could not imagine that their SUV would not stand in front of the door. They were just not understanding it. They were shouting at the mayor. And there are pictures, and I have witnessed scenes that were not nice. Others were dreaming of a better future. These were the elderly people who were dreaming of times back when the bicycles were in the street and not everything was blocked by cars. And it was young people. And in the end, it worked extremely well. And people were extremely grateful that they could make the experience. And 1 month touches people's lives and activity schedules. A weekend is nothing. If you don't like bicycles in the street, in a weekend you go to a lake and have your Sunday there. So that's nothing. But in a month, once you have to go to the dentist, you cannot postpone it for a month maybe. Kids have to go to the music lesson and so on. So the daily lives have to be reorganized in an eco-mobile fashion. So that took place there. So it was not just a festival, but we called it festival to give it a friendly touch. Because once you free up the public space and the cars are no longer there, you can almost be frightened because there's so much space. How do you fill it? And people need to see a sense in it that they get rid of the car for a month. And if there is nothing, they might doubt that it was a good exercise. So of course there were some festival activities, street theaters, musics, and so concerts organized. So it went well, and if you want, you can watch videos on the internet that document this whole process. There's also a book about it.
What was the total population that was impacted?
Only 4,300 people.
4,000. And then afterwards, how many of those people continued to adopt an alternative way of getting around?
I cannot give a number right now, but what happened is the city convened roundtables and said, after this exercise, how do you want it in the future? And people actually decided they wanted to have an area-wide speed limit to 20 kilometers per hour, and they wanted parking restrictions that you could, in the major streets, no longer park at all. And this had actually led, I was recently there, has led to a traffic calming that was unprecedented. Only few cars in the streets. All the through traffic has gone because it's no longer attractive for people to use this shortcut when they have to go 20 kilometers per hour. Still cyclists in the street that were not there before, but I unfortunately don't have numbers in terms of which households went eco-mobile forever.
It'd be interesting. I mean, it'd be interesting to keep tracking that to see if it did actually change, you know, the actual patterns of use. And maybe on that, I mean, in terms of getting the fundamentals right, then if you remove the requirement for the car, the space can be used for other things. And I think we talked, you know, there's quite a few points on getting the fundamentals right. And if I could maybe switch to Dr. Brosta, and you come from Hamburg, of which Hamburg always rates really high in terms of livability. Very livable community, reasonably well-connected urban transport, a lot of new neighborhoods that are walkable, good cycling network, and it's got a lot of charm in terms of kind of the port city. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about ways of which you know, urban planning and some of that structural planning contributed to the outcome that you see in Hamburg today and creating that as a real livable community.
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, thank you for describing Hamburg in such a nice and also true way. I think, actually, you already mentioned one of the key issues and one of the key factors, and it is city planning. And Hamburg really has a tradition for city planning that goes back over a century. And Hamburg was always constructed, at least from the beginning of the 20th century onwards, with a city model in mind, in a certain way of the city being organized first along the major traffic axes. Then after World War II and most of the city was destroyed, we really put a lot of emphasis in building what was then called the functionally differentiated city, which was what people wanted back then, living someplace and working someplace else. Then, of course, causing the traffic, then building the roads in order to deal with the traffic. And now we really experience that this kind of model of a city doesn't work anymore in the same way, but that people actually want the walkable, the bikeable city where they can actually do everything that they want to do within a mile radius of where they live. They want to work there, they want to go to school there, or drop their kids off there for daycare. And so really, the way that you design new city projects and new housing projects really helps reducing traffic just by organizing city differently. And we're doing this now. We have the largest inner-city European urban construction project, which is called the Hafen City. It's a brownfield conversion project where we use parts of the harbor that were old parts that were not being used after container terminals moved in and transform them into a place for living. 5,000 flats are going to be built there, and they have a completely different design of the streets and of the way that mobility is working there. We have the same thing in the conversion project where there used to be a train station that will be left off in the early 20s of the century, and there will be 5,000 flats as well, and we were building a completely new district there as well, trying new ways of organizing it. And I think the key factor that leads in Hamburg is that we try to offer choices, so that we really want to give you the choice of using the vehicle and the mode of transportation that you want. You need a capable public transportation system. Of course, you need roads that work. You need roads that can deal with cars, with bikes, with pedestrians. You need, the most important thing is you need to have the switch points. You need to have the intermodality of traffic so that you can start by car, going maybe to the public transport, and then hop off there, and then hop off the underground, and then go on a bike that you share. And so really having all these things seamlessly connected. And we can do so now because we have the data and we have the mobile devices that give you the information about what you can use at which point in time. So that's really what we're working on now, is really offering you any choice you want, and knowing that once people have the choice, they are sensible and they make choices that help reduce car traffic without us telling them to reduce car traffic. Because if we did that, we'd have a cultural war. That's not what we want. But we are very sure that once we offer the alternatives, there will be a change in lifestyle and a change in the way that transportation is being dealt with.
That's very interesting, because I think it's linking technology to solutions that are provided, and then providing individuals more information. And I guess in that, in terms of how you connect, is that something that you've promoted a lot in terms of creating apps and creating ability for people to create their own applications to connect better to different uses? And I think with that, I mean, there's a few companies that come out of Hamburg recently, especially on the smaller vehicles, which are trying to share that vehicle. And with that is the development of the technology to connect to individuals. So is that something that the government is involved with, or do you push that to private sector to really play a bigger role in that?
Well, basically both. We have the intermodality as really being one part of the things that our public transportation company is responsible of. We have a project called Switch, and the public transport company, which is owned by the city, is supposed to build the hubs where you can change from the underground, from the bus, on car sharing, on the bike, and maybe on other devices as well, on taxi stands. Really have like everything else in different hubs that you build in the city, and they manage it. And so they're responsible for that. And then, of course, we have a very vibrant startup and tech scene, and they're developing things like we saw the scooters Flotility, which is a startup based in Hamburg and in Singapore, and where we also see then the limits of what we're doing, because they designed this project and they build it here now, and they are not able to use it on Hamburg streets because the federal and the European legislation doesn't allow it, because it's technically a car, basically. It's a light car. It's not a bike. That's the problem, since there is a motor on it. And so you need to dissolve this, and we are a city-state, but we are not a federal city-state, so we are no nation. So we need to convince our government in order to change the laws, and need the national parliament to do so that we can implement this in Hamburg as well. And then they're already talking with the guys who do Switch, who do these hubs, and then have these things there as well, so that you can go the last mile from the bus station or the underground with this scooter then back home. But there, of course, there's Europe, and as we always say, it's invented there, it's made a business model in the US, and Europe finds out how to regulate it, and we are still working on this, finding out how to regulate it.
That's very interesting. Actually, we had Flotility. I don't know if he's not here today, but he was part of one of our workshops and actually added a lot to the content. Actually, Mayor Kabell, if you could also add to that in terms of on the connection point with technology and how Copenhagen is looking at that.
We try to use the city as a lab. I think one of the interesting things that Gabe said before was that his meeting with city planners and engineers was a resounding no. I think I've heard that story before, once or twice, about Copenhagen as well. But the interesting thing is, of course, to use the city as a lab, to open up the streets, to open up the city and saying, if you've got a solution, come to us, let's try it out. Some of it may work. Cool, then we'll implement it in the whole city. Some of it won't, and then we'll tear it down. No problem. We just inaugurated last month what we call Copenhagen Street Lab, which is a part of the central part of town, where we are basically opening up for all those companies who have a new kind of smart city solution, an ITS solution, and saying, test it out here. And just make sure that the results are open, so they're available not only for the city and for the private company, but for everybody. And make sure that it's transparent, and make sure that it adheres to privacy policies. Those three demands are the only ones we have. But basically, otherwise, use Copenhagen as much as you like, and then let's see if it works.
That's good. How about in, Mr. Kim, in Seoul? What about in the Seoul government? Is there a similar type of thing in terms of promoting private enterprise to come in and find urban solutions around mobility?
Well, you just asked the public-private?
No, so I mean, these are both examples of where private companies could come in and look at providing an urban solution around creating connections or applications, or being able to actually create a business model around connecting people in mobility. So I'm wondering if Seoul is looking at some of the things. I mean, Seoul has a very high IT-enabled culture, and I must think that what's the role of the government in that, and how is that working in terms of creating solutions for connecting people around the city?
Well, actually, the developed IT techniques is one of our proud, Even in my house, we sometimes talk with my wife just by smartphone. And we use smart card on the transportation system, more than 95% of all passengers. So anyway, we can monitor what's happening in all our mass transit system in real time. And of course, we have a very developed IT techniques. So if we combine these two data, I mean the big data, then we can solve some innovative solution, I think. So 3 years ago, we made a night bus. We call it our bus because it runs only in midnight, from 12 in the night and until 5 o'clock in the morning. So it was, at that time, we tried to which route is the best for those who work midnight. In order to find the route, we used the big data of smartphone. Which place the people use smartphone most. And we took some line, and it was really success. So we spent only a small budget for that project, but unfortunately, it won the first prize in Seoul City's policy. So actually, my mayor was so disappointed about that because the citizens never remember the biggest budget project, but just that project they remembered. So anyway, we are trying to find more innovative projects using that kind of data. Yeah.
Okay, I would like to ask a last question to all the panelists so that we can then begin to open the questions to the floor. If I were to remember one lesson from each of you, what would that be? Maybe in 2 sentences. Starting with Gabe. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, geez. I mean, actually, I like what the mayor said here. If you build it, they will come. I mean, it's so true. We overcomplicate things too much. I also like the idea of piloting, which has been brought up a number of times. So, quick build, iterative approaches, low cost means higher quality, more fiscally responsible choices in the long run. And sometimes from government, we just need a bold move instead of a whole lot of thinking about how to get around the bold move. You just got to do it.
Yeah, be bold and do it, yes. Okay, President Kim.
Well, today's topic is Car-Lite, but if we replace the word Car-Lite, it's heavy public transportation. So I would emphasize the importance of a public transportation system. In order to achieve more car-lighted society, we should invest more on the public transportation, I think.
Yes, that's what Seoul's been doing a lot. Yes.
I say that what we've seen in Copenhagen is that going green, transforming the city into a green city has actually been the key part of Copenhagen never being in recession, never actually having a failing economy throughout the financial crisis. The London School of Economics issued a report 2 years ago showing that if Copenhagen hadn't gone green, then we would have been hit as badly as any other Western city. So for us, I'll say just get started, you'll never regret it. And going green is actually also going economically, business-wise, sensible and sustainable.
And Copenhagen has been ranked happiest city in the world. Okay, Dr. Broster.
Yeah. Well, I think my advice is do everything, but do it now. Don't discuss too long on what part of transportation you want to cope with and what you don't, but just develop everything. Build new undergrounds, enable your buses, make your buses emission-free, team up among the cities and force companies to build emission-free buses, which is something that we should all work on because they still don't do this, they don't provide it. Make your cities bikeable, make them walkable, do it now and offer people the choices to decide the mode of transportation that they want to use in the city for themselves. They will meet the right choices.
If you want a bold move, if you think people cannot really follow, they cannot imagine that the future could be different, it's possible to let them play the future for 1 month in their given environment, I always say, real city, real people in real time. So that has proven to be possible and to bring a breakthrough in people's mindset.
I think these have been very, very good comments for the audience to take back to your respective agencies and companies to do it quicker, get it done faster, and you'll see results. With that, I think we'd like to open it up. So if people have questions for the panelists or questions for
introduce
Limin and
yourself.
myself,
Yeah, introduce yourself and
you just raise your hand.
questions.
Hi, Stephen Englund with AECOM. I have a question I guess, to the research group first. Did you consider the impact of change in deliveries and logistics in your comprehensive look at how streets are going to be used?
Yeah, actually, so we've talked a lot about moving people. But the one thing we did talk about was moving goods and how to move goods in a more coordinated effort, which would help to reduce the amount of truck traffic and the amount of deliveries to the same point. That was actually not a big conversation. Partly that might have been the people that were in the workshops. And it did become part of both in terms of demand management, traffic demand management, and then facilities, adequate facilities in terms of movement. There is work, though, that's going on here in Singapore on logistics and doing more hub and spoke type of logistics distribution, which combines closer proximity to port and airport to hubs, and then distribution of hubs. And we did talk a little bit about new models of moving goods, which might be through drones over bus lanes, which by doing that, you can move it to housing estates, which will reduce a significant amount of truck traffic. And then the other part was the cold chain about combining the distribution of cold goods into single vehicles. So instead of at the restaurant having 20 trucks show up to deliver the cheese, the milk, each one's from a different company, that's all done at a sorting house and then delivered to the end restaurant or to a mall or to a group of facilities. So that was discussed. I guess it doesn't come up that much in what we've shown.
Hey, Scott.
It's a good point.
And there was one other thing, because you actually covered some of that, I remember, in our session. But then we also talked about, when we were talking about autonomous vehicles and some of the technologies that were coming, and even if they don't come as soon as we thought, that limiting certain types of deliveries with heavy trucks to nighttime, midnight to 6 a.m., like is done in places in Northern Europe, and it's actually been tested in New York and DC, could really help. Particularly help with the conflicts between pedestrians, cyclists, and trucks, but also obviously the roads are typically much clearer. And that's why you don't need autonomous vehicles to test it. But when we get to the point where we do have autonomous vehicles and they're ferrying people during peak hours, they could be ferrying packages during off-peak hours.
Yes, hello, my name is Rita from Hong Kong. I have a question about the people-public-private partnership as new model of collaboration. How does it actually work? I mean, what was your experience? And can it be used for all urban decision making? And what did the experts say?
I mean, I have a quick thought. When we were at the Young Leaders Summit yesterday, and we had the chairman of Nestle there, and they're I think the world's largest producer of bottled water. And he had a very interesting comment, Mr. Brabeck, he had an interesting comment about the fact that more governments are in debt now than ever have been before, and the private sector really has the money, so we have to collaborate. But then he also talked about it from a geopolitical standpoint, that water is going to become a very, very precious resource, and we discussed the fact that 2/3 of the world is facing a water shortage. So this is a guy in the private sector, very powerful, and he said, one of the worst things that could happen is that we transfer control of the water supply in a country to the private sector, particularly with the paradigm of the private sector having all the money. I thought that was very interesting. I think there's certain things you don't want to hand over to the private sector.
Just let me add to that, because I'm very much on the same line. I think the thing that we have to see at the moment is, this goes for transportation as well as for many other aspects of public service, is that we have the attempt of the private sector to deliver the goods as well, or better, or do the job better than, or at least proclaim to do the job better than the government did. And I think that the most important thing for the public sector is to be able and to have the judgment to decide whether or not that's the case, and then to decide on the right model. And what we see very often is that in all these smart city discourses, that there are smaller communities not having these capacities to basically being taken over by tech companies, to saying, well, we do all this stuff for you. And nobody knows how this is going to work out, because at the moment it's public domain, and we know that we have a democratic and a public hand on it and have the development, and nobody knows what will happen once it's privatized. So the government and the public servants will have, it's key that they have the judgment to decide whether or not this should be state controlled fully and we just need a contractor, whether or not we can do it in a public-private partnership, or we can give it and release it as a market to the private sector and say, well, do your own thing. It's not that essential for the good living of my people as for the government it to be important to have their hands on it. And I really think that this judgment is something that we desperately need to develop, because not everybody in the public sector has it at the moment. And that's why there is so much confusion at this intersection between the public and the private sector at the moment.
Hi, hello. My name is Danson. I write about transport at the Straits Times. I just have a question. I don't know if you guys have had the chance to look at how developed Singapore is, or look at some of the urban planning in Singapore. But I just wanted to ask you, if Singapore had to do one thing to go Car-Lite, you know, what in your mind, what is the most important thing that it should look at right now, at this right this time?
This will be in the paper tomorrow morning, so be clear.
So, you know, what I've learned traveling around the world and seeing different governments, local and national, is there are governments that do the big things really well, the big projects, and there are governments that do the small iterative things very well. And it's hard, I mean, like a place like Copenhagen, places in the Netherlands like Amsterdam, those are places that do both very well, or Paris. And so I think Singapore is very good at the big infrastructure projects, you know, remaking the riverfront, building the MRT, doubling the MRT. But then reallocating street space away from cars has been very challenging. So I think the cultural change is tough. And I think I just met with the Land Transport Authority today, and you know, one of the things I said is, I think for some things you just have to do it. You just have to do it, and you have to explain to the public and to the stakeholders, not we want your feedback on whether we should do it or not. You have to say we're going to do it, and we want your feedback on how we do it. And you get a very different response.
I'll go back here first. And then...
Hello, my name is Francis Chu. I'm from Love Cycling, cycling platform in Singapore. There's a lot of talk about bike share among our group members, and understand in Chicago there's a bike share system, right? And what I want to know is, from your experience, what is the meaningfulness, or what is the best use of a bike share system? And also, in terms of the operation, what are the major challenges?
I guess that's for me. So we launched a system with 300 stations, 3,000 bikes. It's now at like 500 and some stations and bikes. So I think bigger is better. And a lot of systems that you see in cities that are not doing well, it's because the city says, I want to have a bike share system. They dip their toe in the water, they put in 10 stations, 30 stations. That's not meaningful. It becomes something for tourists to use. If you want it to be meaningful, it's a nodal system, just like a subway. So you want to make it big. You want to market it to people properly, just like a private sector company would market their services. And so we worked hard to make it feel like a private sector offering. We worked with IDEO to actually put together the branding for it. And you know, in a place like Singapore, I think one thing I've learned is my second trip here, the weather is different, the climate's different, the culture is different. So do you need electric bikes? Maybe. Do you need covered bike facilities? Because if you just put in bike share with no facilities, that's not so good. If you just put in facilities with no bike share, that's not so good. You really want to do both. But what I've learned is putting in both is the way to change the culture really quickly. Because you put in the facilities to make people safe. Maybe it's not as many as you want, but you start down that road, and then you provide them a way to use it without any capital outlay, right? And you make it as frictionless as possible, so it should be super duper easy to use and to get a membership.
Well, I'm looking for a kind of workable model for promoting bike riding in cities. So first of all, Gabe, you worked in Chicago before, so would you say that the model of having public transportation, like train, plus the last kilometers, I use kilometers, is a suitable model for very large cities? Because in Asia, including Seoul, cities are very big. So this is one question. And to the mayor of Copenhagen, I think your city is smaller. Are you also subscribing to having train system plus the last kilometers? Or do you think in a smaller city you can have just bike all the way? Because when I was in Copenhagen, I was told that people can ride for 27 kilometers with no problem, even in winter. So in other words, there could be two models depending on the sizes of the city. And so then for both of you, I have two questions. One is, when you can, because I'm not looking for city model. So if both models, as I imagine, are workable, does it mean that in your experience, that there's no problem in removing one or two lanes in the roads for bikes? Because in Singapore, it's very hard for me to imagine creating a new bike lane as distinct from a pedestrian lane. So I think removing a traffic lane seems to be the only way for us to do so. And finally, is that what do you do in both cases when it rains?
I'll be very quick to let the mayor have some time. Let me start at the end. So that's why I think you need to have some cover here on some of the lanes. I actually think you need to do something different here because it does rain so much and people are so sensitive to it. In terms of the size of the city, if it's very small, like Deventer in the Netherlands, they don't have a transit system per se, and they limit the downtown just to pedestrians. No bikes even. Then bikes and pedestrians, and then when you get outside of that perimeter, it's cars and bikes. And what was the third question? It was about, taking car lanes. You have to do it. And it's not actually that hard. It's taking the first one that's hard on a major arterial road, like Pennsylvania Avenue. But once you do it, you realize, it was no big deal. Because of the concept of induced demand, and because it's a system. So if you take one lane away, people drive a different way. And after a time, they start using the other mode of transit or bike. And we took 22 people to Copenhagen to convince them, including our deputy mayor, that this was the way to go.
Copenhagen is a city, Greater Copenhagen is a city about 2 million on the Danish side. And what I see usually is people choose the bike for distances up to 5 to 6 kilometers. We'd like to expand that up to 10 to 12. Some of the initiatives there will be e-bikes, like the Dutch are very good at doing. But of course, creating supercycle highways between the central part of the Greater Copenhagen area and the suburbs or municipalities is another key part. But Copenhageners can take their bicycles on the trains as well. So what you actually see is the last kilometer being used, because people take the bike to the train, bring it with them on the train, and then use it to go to work as well. Or they use the bike share system as well that is placed in stations. So for me, there are many ways of actually being able to enhance it. And as for the rain, well, I think Copenhageners used to say there's no such thing as bad weather. There's only bad clothing. And that's being said, I was out in Bishop Park this morning at 8 o'clock. in bad clothing, because of course the weather was great. But there is, I mean, people, the problem is not the rain in Copenhagen, the problem would be the sleet and the snow. Actually making sure that you get through traffic in the morning when it's -5 and it's sleet and you really don't want to be out there. But one of the things we are doing in Copenhagen is actually clearing the bicycle lanes before we clear the roads. That sends a very clear signal to all the car drivers that they are being down prioritized. Because basically we only clear the roads when we are done clearing the bicycle lanes, and that can take a lot of time. As for removing car lanes, I very much agree with Gabe. I mean, just get started, and you actually increase the capacity in the mobility system by doing so, because the capacity on a bicycle lane is 5 times the number of people that you have in a car lane. So if you want to increase mobility on the street, remove those car lanes and get in bicycle lanes. Then you actually have more space for people, because it's not the number of vehicles that's interesting, it's the number of people that are being transported.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think Singapore has made great strides in the last couple of years on cycling and connecting in alternative ways. A lot of that's being done through the park network. And so it's a very much a recreational route, and it's not a direct route. And I think that's the next real bold step for Singapore in terms of very much connecting population centers, residential to employment, that are easy, efficient, and direct, which was one part of our first recommendation out of our active mobility report, which we did 2 years ago. With that, I'd like to thank the panelists for their response. I think it was very insightful. Thank you very much, and let's thank the panelists.